History often paints a picture of a humble monk standing alone against a monolithic, oppressive empire. We are told that Martin Luther was the great liberator of the human mind, the man who broke the traditional chains of medieval dogma to gift the world the freedom of conscience. In this popular modern narrative, he is the pioneer of individual liberty, the brave hero who finally allowed every human being to think for themselves and interpret the divine without a mediator. But history is rarely as clean or as noble as the textbooks suggest. Behind the stone statues and the celebratory hymns lies a much darker reality that many contemporary institutions prefer to keep hidden in the shadows. To truly understand the legacy of the Reformation, we must look past the sanitized myth and peer directly into the smoke of a cold December morning in the year 1520. Outside the Elster Gate in Wittenberg, the winter air was thick with the smell of burning parchment and old leather. Martin Luther stood before a gathered crowd of students and faculty, but he wasn't just burning a piece of paper. With a defiant gesture, he cast into the flames the Exsurge Domine, the papal bull that threatened his excommunication. However, the fire consumed something much larger that day. Luther threw the entire body of canon law into the pyre. This was not a mere protest against administrative corruption or the sale of indulgences. It was a total, violent rejection of the legal and spiritual order that had held Western civilization together for a millennium. By burning these books, Luther declared that the historical laws of the Church no longer held any power over his will. It was a signal of total war against a unified Christian authority, a moment where the individual ego was placed above the collective wisdom of the ages. Today, modern Protestantism often presents a heavily filtered version of this history to its followers. We see the recurring image of a courageous scholar, but we rarely hear about the savage rhetoric or the authoritarian actions that characterized his leadership. The pure origin story we are sold conveniently ignores the fact that the very man who preached Christian liberty would soon call for the literal execution of those who dared to interpret the Bible differently than he did. This is the central paradox of sola scriptura, the revolutionary idea that the Bible alone is the final authority. Luther's promise that every man could be his own priest quickly turned into a chaotic landscape of conflicting interpretations. When other reformers emerged with their own unique ideas, Luther did not celebrate their freedom of conscience. Instead, he felt a desperate, almost obsessive need to suppress them by force, convinced that his specific interpretation was the only one truly guided by the divine spirit. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Luther's early writings were far more than theological debates. They were inflammatory incitements to civil unrest. He moved beyond questioning church practices and began attacking the very existence of the Catholic hierarchy, calling for a radical dismantling of the entire social order. This was not just a spiritual shift, it was a political explosion that threatened to tear Germany apart. To understand why this happened, we must examine the true character of the reformer. Luther was a man of extreme volatility and dark moods. History records his intense scrupulosity, an obsession with his perceived sins, which fueled a deep-seated rage against any institution that offered a structured sacramental path to grace. He possessed a terrifying conviction that anyone who disagreed with his theological conclusions was not just mistaken, but an active agent of the devil himself. From the Catholic perspective, the Church was acting as the necessary guardian of truth. The hierarchy recognized that the fragmentation of the faith was a looming disaster that would lead to centuries of bloodshed and the eventual dissolution of unity. They feared that by making truth entirely subjective, Luther was opening a Pandora's box of permanent division and social collapse. They were protecting the unity of Christendom from a fragmentation that would destroy the peace of nations. As we will see, those fears were tragically well-founded. The small fires lit in Wittenberg were only the beginning of a massive conflagration that would soon consume the lives of thousands, as the liberator transformed into a judge who demanded the sword. This religious revolution claimed to offer freedom, but it often demanded absolute obedience to the new doctrines or faced the wrath of the state. The true fire was just beginning. The words of Martin Luther, once intended to shake the foundations of the papacy, soon took on a life of their own among the desperate and the downtrodden. By 1524, the German peasantry, long crushed by the weight of feudal taxes and social inequality, heard in the Reformer's message a divine mandate for their own total liberation. They saw his promise of freedom as a call to break their literal chains. His words acted as a spark in a field of dry straw. Tens of thousands of laborers rose up across the German lands in what became known as the Peasants' War. These were common men who truly believed that the gospel demanded a dismantling of the oppressive earthly hierarchies that kept them in poverty. However, this hope was met with a brutal and cold-blooded betrayal that forever stained the history of the Reformation. As the uprising threatened the nobility, Luther's tone shifted from encouragement to rage. He was horrified that his ideas were being used to challenge the secular hierarchy that ensured his safety and the survival of his movement. In his infamous 1525 treatise, Against the Murderous, Thieving Hordes of Peasants, Luther did not call for peace or mediation. Instead, he unleashed a torrent of violent commands that sanctioned a massive massacre. He explicitly ordered the German princes to show no mercy, writing that they should stab, smite, and slay the rebels wherever they found them. He promised these secular rulers that by killing the peasants, they were doing the work of God, declaring that anyone who died in the service of suppressing the rebellion would have a more blessed death than any martyr. The result was a bloodbath of unimaginable proportions. Armed with the theological blessing of their spiritual leader, the German princes launched a campaign of systematic slaughter. The theological blessing of the Reformer turned the German countryside into a graveyard. The fields of Germany were stained red. Approximately 100,000 peasants were killed, many hunted like animals after surrendering. The man who preached against the sword now architected a genocide against his own followers. This was the moment the Reformation's promise of liberty was sacrificed on the altar of political power and princely favor. The peasants who had looked to Luther as a spiritual father were left decimated and abandoned by the man who had incited their initial fervor. This streak of intolerance was not limited to the rebellious poor. In reality, Luther's regime of conscience was remarkably narrow. He grew to loathe anyone who dared to move further than he did in the rejection of tradition. The Anabaptists, for instance, were a group that took Luther's idea of personal biblical interpretation to its logical conclusion, yet they were met with the same lethal force as the peasants. Luther and his colleague Melanchthon provided the theological justifications for the execution of these sectarians, whether by drowning, fire, or the sword. Those who disagreed with the specific Lutheran orthodoxy found that the freedom of the Reformation was a one-way street. To justify this alliance with state violence, Luther developed his two kingdoms doctrine. This theology taught that while the spiritual kingdom belonged to God, the secular kingdom, the world of politics and physical bodies, belonged entirely to the princes. The secular sword now dictated the path to salvation. By stripping the church of its independent authority and legal protections, Luther handed the keys of the soul to the state, creating the first state-run churches in the West. This was not a liberation of the individual, it was the birth of modern absolutism, where the prince reigned supreme over both body and soul. As the Lutheran movement solidified its power, it turned its focus toward the total erasure of Catholic life in the territories it controlled. Monasteries were closed and their lands seized by the nobility. The holy sacrifice of the Mass, the very heartbeat of Christian life, was banned and replaced by services that adhered strictly to Luther's new mandates. To be a Catholic in these newly reformed lands was to be a criminal. The reformer had systematically demolished the old path, proving his vision required the destruction of the past's sacred legacy. His hand, which once held the pen, now directed the executioner. The campaign against the old world did not end with the blood of the peasants. It extended into a systematic erasure of the intellectual and artistic heritage of centuries. Across the German territories, the Reformation sparked a wave of iconoclasm that saw the destruction of priceless Catholic manuscripts, liturgical books, and sacred art. To Luther, these were idols. Libraries that had been meticulously preserved by monks for generations were emptied, their contents thrown into the flames. Beautiful statues were decapitated, and vibrant frescoes were whitewashed, leaving a sterile, cold landscape where once the visual splendor of the faith had spoken to the illiterate and the learned alike. This was a cultural revolution that sought to rewrite history by incinerating its records. As Luther aged, his intolerance only deepened, moving from the rejection of Rome to a terrifying hostility toward any group that refused his new orthodoxy. In 1543, he published his infamous treatise on the Jews and their lies. This was no mere theological disagreement. It was a manual for state-sponsored persecution. Luther advocated for the burning of synagogues, the destruction of Jewish homes, and the confiscation of their wealth. He suggested that they should be forced into manual labor, and that their rabbis should be forbidden to teach under the threat of death. This dark legacy reveals a man who, having dismantled the traditional moral authority of the Church, felt justified in using the total power of the state to crush those he deemed irredeemable. While the modern world often hears tales of the cruel Catholic Inquisition, history frequently ignores the Protestant Inquisition. Unlike the Catholic process, which involved legal protections and ecclesiastical courts, the executions in Protestant lands were often swift and dictated by the whims of secular princes. In territories governed by the Two Kingdoms doctrine, heresy was treated as treason against the state. The legal guardrails of canon law had been burned, leaving the individual at the mercy of political rulers who used theology to solidify their control over their subjects' bodies and souls. This was not a liberation, but a cold exchange of spiritual authority for worldly dominion. Why are these facts so often absent from our history books? The answer lies in the Black Legend and the historiography of the 19th and 20th centuries. By casting the Catholic Church as a villainous, regressive force, they sanitized the violent reality of the Protestant Revolution. They ignored the pyres of books and the corpses of peasants to maintain a narrative of a pure intellectual liberation. Church resistance to Luther was not a rejection of reform, but a defense of the deposit of faith and the survival of Western civilization. The hierarchy understood that if the objective truth of the Church were replaced by the subjective interpretation of the individual, the result would be a fragmented society where might makes right. We see the echoes of this fragmentation in our world today. The subjectivism birthed in the 16th century has evolved into a modern culture where truth is whatever the individual or the loudest ideological group claims it to be. The cancel culture, with its demands for the erasure of the past, shares a direct lineage with the iconoclasm and the book burnings of the Reformation. When we lose a shared, objective moral foundation, we are left only with the fire and the sword to settle our differences. Look beyond the myths, research the primary sources, read Luther's own words, and rediscover the beauty, consistency, and historical truth that the Catholic Church sought to protect. The freedom offered by the Reformation was a revolution that demanded absolute obedience to the new state or the loss of one's life. Recognizing the heavy cost of this fire now is the necessary first step toward rediscovering the light of the truth that remains for all to see.